Scores were injured. The pictures and the accounts of survivors who also reached England today later in the programme. In the Commons, the row over the Prime Minister's alleged responsibility for not anticipating the Argentine invasion has erupted in a major way. There's disagreement too about the form and nature of any inquiry to be set up into the origins of the invasion. I'll be asking David Steele, the Liberal leader, what form of inquiry he thinks the country needs. For 6 years, an English girl, Daisy Hobson, has been kept incommunicado in an Argentine jail. But now we hear from her family as they decide to speak out.
Well, we feel that while the world's attention is on Argentina at the moment, and she hasn't been able to get out in 6.5 years, it's time that something was done.
And on the eve of the return of the Rolling Stones to London for 2 sold-out mass shows, Robin Denslow hears from Stones guitarist Keith Richards about his 10-year battle with drugs.
It's heroin, you end up just appreciating that's all you want. Nothing else is interesting to you particularly at all. And so it's been like a gradual rediscovery of the other joys of life.
That later in the programme. Well, who is really to blame for not foreseeing the Argentine military junta would invade the Falklands? That question lurking at the back of every mind while the fighting was in progress, that doubt that was not really voiced while lives were being lost, came out into the open this afternoon in the Commons. James Callaghan, former Labour Prime Minister and now one of Parliament's elder statesmen, moved it firmly into the centre of the political arena.
Does she not consider that she made a gross error?
Cadbury's Smash Rattle.
Time and whatever.
Brothers for nearly 20 years. Will you be tuned in for it? Try tuning a spare button on your set before 8 p.m. And if you can get this clearly, then you're all set. If you can't, it may be that you're not in range of a Channel 4 transmitter just yet. We're bringing more on as fast as we can. But perhaps all you need is expert advice. Ask your dealer or rental company. Channel 4 is on its way.
It's a pleasure to have your company this evening here on Thames. A lot of entertainment to come. Now.
Now, Mrs. Thatcher has already outlined her ideas of an inquiry. It's now fairly public knowledge, and in the Commons she was adamant that she was not going to conceal anything, but she added these crucial words: "I wish everything to be out, including every single thing under this government and previous governments." And the timescale now being officially mentioned is 17 years, a timescale over which there is, according to senior ministers, no room for negotiation. Now, the opposition parties, in their turn, want a rather narrower inquiry, encouraged by fragmentary but suggestive evidence, such as Mrs. Thatcher's letter to a supporter some time ago, pointing to a government lack of awareness of the imminence of an Argentine threat. If Mrs. Thatcher has won the war politically, the opposition now said that she may be vulnerable over the issue of failing to prevent it. The Liberal leader, David Steele, has replied to Mrs. Thatcher's proposals about the form of an inquiry. He's in our Westminster studio now. David Steele, do you object to this figure of 17 years that it is now virtually officially admitted? That is, the review must cover the last 17 years of governmental policies.
I don't object to an inquiry going back over the history of the way in which this country has dealt with the Falklands over that period of time. We had, after all, the Shackleton report. That was shelved, nothing was done. I think that's an interesting and perhaps useful exercise. But the point I'm making is that the top priority for the inquiry must be to look at the period immediately leading up to the disaster of the Argentine invasion.
That's a matter of months.
That's a matter of months and no longer than that. And I think that the inquiry should concentrate on that first. It may well be useful for it to delve into the history and indeed to publish perhaps a second report, but that will take a bit longer. And I don't want to see the inquiry held up by going back over all our transactions concerning the Falklands since 1965.
If senior ministers say, though, that the inquiry has got to cover 17 years, does this look to you like a way of diverting attention from the events of the last few months before the invasion?
I repeat, I don't mind them looking over 17 years, so long as their priority task is to report to the House of Commons and indeed to the British public on what went wrong in the months and weeks leading up to the invasion. That must be their first task. and let them by all means go on thereafter to look at the longer period of history.
Are you also concerned about the actual composition of the inquiry? It's being said this evening that it will be a three-man team, one Labour Privy Councillor, one Conservative Privy Councillor, one lawyer or historian. How eager are you to have some official Liberal representation there?
Well, I can't say, obviously, what the Prime Minister has proposed to me in advance of my meeting with her, but what I can say is that my view all along has been that the inquiry itself, in its composition and in its powers, must have public and parliamentary confidence that it's not just an inquiry appointed tamely by the government to look into the government, but that it is a broadly independent inquiry. And at the moment, I think I have to say that what the Prime Minister is proposing doesn't quite measure up to that requirement.
Does it look as if there is room for manoeuvre, as if you make further suggestions that the Prime Minister will listen to them, or do you get the impression that her mind is closed on the form and the substance of the inquiry?
Well, she's invited me to see her next week, and I will do on this subject. I must assume that since she's invited me to talk to her about it, that she's open to other ideas. But certainly my mind is quite clear that if the inquiry is to have broad public and parliamentary support, it must start by having parliamentary confidence on a broad basis.
How quickly do you think it ought to report?
Well, I think it ought to report on the immediate issue of what happened in the prelude to the invasion no later than the autumn. I think there are other issues. There's not just the long period of the history of dealing with the Falklands. I think it could usefully deal with questions like arms sales to the Argentine and other countries, but that could be a later matter. I think that the whole country wants to know why was it that in the weeks, not months, but weeks prior to the invasion, the messages from Endurance, the messages from our embassy in Buenos Aires, the messages via the Americans, somehow didn't penetrate through to policy, that we'd announced that the ship would be withdrawn, for example.
So it really mustn't be allowed to drag on beyond the autumn?
I don't think that the immediate issue should be allowed to drag on more than the next few months.
David Seal, thank you very much. And now back to the war itself and the pictures that are now coming out of some of the events of the key moments of the war. One of them, by any standards, one of the most extraordinary ones, one of the low points of the campaign was the attack on Bluff Cove, as the supply vessels, Sir Tristram and Sir Galahad, were caught napping by Argentine Skyhawks with hundreds of troops still unloaded from the vessels. And today there was the first chance to see it as it happened and to hear the accounts of some of the survivors. More than 100 of them returned in 2 RAF VC-10s, some of the luckiest members of the task force returning to Bryce Norton in Oxfordshire. It was a warm welcome from their families and from military staff, with the near disaster of June the 8th seeming a long way away already. But the Bluff Cove attacks did cost 50 lives, and with the pictures we're about to see, the first of the destruction of the Royal Fleet Auxiliaries, Sir Galahad and Sir Tristram, we hear also some of these survivors' recollections. Our reporter with the task force is Brian Hanrahan.
Skyhawks 4 or 5 came low across the bay to bomb the 2 landing ships unloading men and supplies. Although missiles were fired, proper air defences hadn't yet been installed. One of the ships, Sir Galahad, burst into flames immediately. The ship had been carrying 2 companies of the Welsh Guards. Although she had been anchored for several hours, they were still aboard.
I made a pipe for abandoned ship, and from thence I rushed around the ship to organise people into doing various activities, launching lifeboats, life rafts. I found it horrific because it happened so suddenly, and everything was chaotic, really. You know, the ship was put into, from a living organisation, was put into something that was out of this world.
Later on, I discovered I was surrounded by smoke on both sides. I couldn't go forward, I couldn't go aft, and ammunition had started going off on the deck above. So I got into the water, and luckily they were seeking helicopters about, and I was heaved out of the water and put ashore.
On the cliff tops, medical staff waited for the helicopters to bring the casualties to them. Many of the injuries were burns. So sudden was the attack, there'd not been time for the crew to put on their anti-flash masks.
I went back in to pick up my medical bag, and the whole of the interior of the ship seemed to be filled with thick black smoke, and you can really see a couple of feet in front of you. The inflatable life rafts were drifting back towards the burning ship, and the helicopter pilots came overhead and directed their downdraft to keep them away. And also they just kept flying in over the forecastle of the ship, picking up the wounded and the rest of the survivors from the forecastle in amongst the smoke.
It took several hours to gather up all the boats and pull them into the shore.
Bring him in. She's coming. Okay, lads, you've got people pulling you in. Pull it! Come on! Jerk the fucking thing, jerk it straight. Pull it! Come on, pull! Hold it!
The medics waded out into the cold water, checking if anyone was hurt.
Don't worry, you're on the camera. Take them to top of the hill, mate.
In the confusion, it took hours to find out who'd survived and who had not. The priority was to save the living, not count the dead.
The Bluff Cove disaster, the story told by our correspondent Brian Hanrahan and some of the survivors. Now, Britain fought for the Falklands because they're British and because Argentina was guilty of aggression. Argentina was also resisted, it was said, because it's a fascist dictatorship. But this morning's Times reminded us that the Argentine military junta arbitrarily arrests people and maltreats them. A front-page story revealed the case of Daisy Hobson, an English girl, daughter of aged parents still resident in Argentina. And she's only the latest in a list of thousands who've disappeared into the junta's jails and vanished for years from public gaze. Here in London, Julian O'Halloran went in search of more information about Daisy Hobson.
It may seem extraordinary that a British girl could be arrested, tortured, tried and held in an Argentinian jail for 6 years without the news leaking out. But the Foreign Office here in London said today that Daisy Hobson's case had in fact been pressed by successive British governments. So the reason for the lack of publicity seems to be that Daisy's elderly parents, who are pillars of Anglo-Argentine society, were both embarrassed about possible publicity and terrified of the effect it might have on their daughter's case. Daisy Hobson was born and brought up in Argentina. She did very well at school, according to her family, both academically and at sport. A girl who apparently had everything. Good looks, a sharp brain, a quick sense of humour, and of course, the right family background. It may have been partly because of that background that her case has been shrouded in secrecy for so long. I asked her sister Virginia, who lives in London, why the news had only come out now.
It's because we were frightened of reprisals there in the Argentine.
What did you think might have happened if you had chosen publicity?
Well, we thought that without publicity that she might stand a chance of being let out by the authorities themselves. We thought if we caused trouble that it would go against her.
And what happened to her after she'd been arrested?
She was, as far as we know, she was blindfolded for 30 days Obviously they removed the blindfold when she signed the confession.
What was that confession that she signed?
I don't know. I don't know.
What sort of treatment did she have at that time? Was she physically maltreated?
I'm not sure how much. I think she wasn't comfortable. I don't know if there was mild torture or not. I suspect there was.
And what happened at the trial?
Well, there was no defense at all. There was a boy put in there ostensibly to look like a defense, but nothing happened. You know, there was no defense at all.
And what
she was sentenced.
And what were the charges against her?
We don't know the charges against her.
You've never been told?
No.
The Foreign Office disclosed today that Daisy Hobson was convicted in 1977. She had been charged with subversion and with possessing arms and explosives. But from the efforts that have been made to obtain her release, it's clear that the British government, at least, thinks there's been a grave miscarriage of justice. What is known is that Daisy was living in Argentina with a man called Ricardo Vieira, and that he had been imprisoned under the last Peronist government on terrorism charges. Last Christmas, 10 British MPs and 10 peers signed a petition to President Galtieri begging him to release Daisy. There was no reply. The Conservative MP Hugh Dykes organised the petition, and during the Falklands crisis that followed, he believed that the Argentine officer and alleged torturer Alfredo Astiz should be questioned about Daisy Hobson while he was being held in England.
Coincidentally, names were given to me of apparent British nationals who had been tortured by him. I made a statement about that separately, but one of the names given on that occasion was Daisy Hobson. I don't think this turns out to be the case. I think she was maltreated by other people connected with Astiz.
But you did hope to interview Lieutenant Colonel Astiz while he was in this country yourself.
Yes.
What happened about your request to do that?
It wasn't possible to meet it, and he was sent back, as you know.
What message would you like to send today to the Argentinian leadership about your sister?
Well, I'd like to see to see her out as soon as possible.